Welcome to the Wild Ag Podcast, where we'll serve as a connection point for landowners and conservation professionals who want to integrate conservation and agriculture. I'm Dr. Andrew Little, Professor of Landscape Ecology and Habitat Management and Extension Specialist at the University of Nebraska.
And I'm Nate Pfluger, Precision Ag Coordinator for Pheasants Forever and an avid outdoorsman with friends and family in my free time. Together, we'll work to bring you perspectives from both landowners and conservation professionals for discussions on soil, water, and wildlife in ag-dominated landscapes.
Welcome back to the Wild Ag Podcast. My name is Dr. Andrew Little. I'm here with my co-host, Nathan Pfluger with Pheasants Forever. We're excited to have Dr. Grace Schuster here today. Grace actually has worked in our lab for the past few years, and so we're going to talk a little bit about her research around bioenergy crops and grassland birds. And so with that, I'll turn it over to you, Grace. Just give us a little background on who you are.
Thanks, Andy. It's really exciting to finally be in the pod lab here with you guys. Finally.
Sure.
I'm Grace Schuster. I went to undergrad here at the University of Nebraska for fisheries and wildlife. And then from there, after I graduated, I went straight into a PhD with Andy, working on bioenergy crop production and its implications for grassland bird communities here in Nebraska. And I just graduated in 2025, and now I'm working as a postdoc for Andy on just a bunch of various different things. So, yeah.
No, it's been awesome. Yeah, it's been fun to go from when you were an undergrad student and working with Dr. Chris Jasinski and I in various projects, and then to then a postdoc or a PhD student, eventually to a postdoc. I'm sure just that kind of evolution, some of that you didn't really forecast that you would ever be doing all of that, at least not at that time. So It's kind of fun to see all that come to fruition.
Yeah, didn't expect to be at UNL for almost 10 years here, but it's been great.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. That's awesome. Cool.
So, first of all, congratulations on, wrapping up your PhD. That's an awesome accomplishment. My first question is when did your interest in wildlife and start, right? Because, undergrad's one thing, but then to roll into a PhD, that's a whole nother commitment. So kind of when did this all start?
I guess really early on in my childhood. I grew up on a farm, so I spent the majority of my childhood outside running around on a farm. And so I obviously came into contact with a bunch of different wildlife species. And I think that just kind of evolved into wanting to understand, why they were on our farm versus not on other farms, and just, why they were, I guess, around certain areas and stuff like that. I remember when I was younger, we would go down into the creek and grab those little crawdads and just bring them back, and you'd catch them. You'd have them as pets for a long time. But then a couple of years later, I realized they weren't there anymore, and they were slowly kind of, and that creek was surrounded by agriculture. And so that just kind of spurred a lot of, interest on my part. So, yeah.
Well, that's been one of the fun things having Grace in the lab, is because she comes from a farm and still farms today, and so in their family farm. And I think it's cool to have that perspective, because obviously a lot of the stuff we do around working lands, is going back to that operation and thinking about, could we do this? Is this stuff that we would honestly be able to implement? And getting those unique perspectives, I don't think that's very common. And with a lot of students. So it's cool to actually have that and getting those different perspectives that can kind of help drive that innovation. So,
well, and not only that, I think it's refreshing for producers to hear that in your position, you came from a farm, right? It's refreshing to hear researchers who have lived the life that they lived.
Right.
And so then you're not necessarily talking at them. You have the ability to sit down and just have a conversation with them because you grew up in that sort of a situation.
Yeah, definitely. And I still continue to farm with my father and grandfather today, which has also really helped my research, because, there's been a lot of things that I've been like, oh, yeah, that's not going to work. That's not going to
There's definitely been some ideas I've tossed out to Grace. Nobody's going to do that. I'm like, okay, well, that's fine. I honestly would rather have those conversations, and that's really what you need. I grew up in a restaurant business in a small town in Pennsylvania, and I remember a farming community, and so very similar to a lot of Nebraska, small towns. You have a local restaurant where a lot of folks go, and they'll take and have coffee in the morning, or a convenience store or whatever. And I remember, hearing all the stories from a lot of those farmers, and that kind of really drew me to especially developing this podcast. It's just another way to be able to help connect people, and then think about, as you bring people like Grace who have that experience being on a farm, getting their perspectives and being like, is this stuff that others would actually do? I grew up, I did 4-H, did FFA, raise market lambs, but we didn't have a big production farm. So, that perspective is very different than what Grace is experiencing as a farmer and now, as a postdoc. So,
absolutely. So kind of diving into your research project here, who were the partners involved in the research project and why did they deem this a research project that should be funded?
Yeah, good question. So there was Pheasants Forever, Nebraska Extension, UNL, and then there was the entomology lab out of North Platte. There was our lab as well. And then USDA, and then Department of Energy.
Yep.
Did I miss any one of them?
And agronomy, Darren Redfern.
Yeah,
so.
yeah.
And actually another one I just thought of is econ was another big one. So
too, yeah.
So the point is we just have a very diverse project and thinking through all the different perspectives, which I think that was something we actually talked to with our previous guest on. That aspect of having these diversified projects so that at the end of the day, it's also gives producers more of a holistic vision and kind of a view of all the research. So maybe they're really passionate about grassland birds, but maybe it's more about something else, and so then it kind of gives them a more holistic perspective of all these different pieces of the puzzle, creating kind of this picture. So
yeah, and then it was Department of Energy funded grant, and it focused on basically in 2006, the Renewable Fuel Standard Program came out, and it was amended to the Clean Water Act by Congress. And it basically mandated that a certain portion of transportation fuel have biofuel in it to help mitigate climate change and stuff like that. And so a lot of research was focused on finding different bioenergy feedstocks that could be used besides corn. And switchgrass is a really notorious one, which is a perennial grass. That's native to North America. And so the whole entire project was basically just looking at the benefits of switchgrass and perennial grasses that could be used for bioenergy to replace corn and what that kind of looks like. So there was focus on insects, pollinators, economics, birds, which was my portion of it, and then overall wildlife.
Yep.
Yeah. So that's very interesting because when I think of biofuels, at least in my area here in Nebraska, really the only thing that I've ever thought about going to ethanol would be corn.
Oh,
right?
Sure.
But switchgrass can also be used instead of corn?
Yes. Yep. Yeah. It's just a different conversion process. And it's a perennial grass, so it can be for 10 years. It's not an annual. So it has a lot of different benefits that corn doesn't. And so that's a really important thing that they were looking into.
Yeah, you can plant it one time, one year, and then you don't have to plant every year like you would a corn crop.
You just harvest it like hay.
Do you know, are there any facilities that are actually using switchgrass as their feedstock?
Not to my knowledge. I think in Oklahoma and Kansas, it's getting a little bit more common. But a lot of the switchgrass that's being used here in the United States is just for studies. So there's even switchgrass fields in Meade, Nebraska, but it's just used for research. It's just small research plots. So there's not really enough switchgrass on the landscape to actually bring it into a bioethanol plant to actually convert it and everything like that.
Yeah, and I think from my understanding, a lot of the ethanol plants could be basically retrofitted to be able to process it. It's just like you were saying, it's a different chemical process than corn in that, processed into ethanol. And so they could do that. It's just another opportunity, another market to jump into. And I know that from the aviation side of things, there is an initiative to help move towards having more sustainable fuel systems long term. And, bioenergy, particularly switchgrass, is one of those opportunities.
So then DOE, the Department of Energy, they wanted to focus specifically on perennial feedstocks, which is kind of where your research comes in?
Yes, yeah. So during that time, we had I think after that amendment was in the Clean Water Act, there was a 20% increase in row crop in corn. And so they thought about that's not really a good thing. That's kind of ag intensification. And so they were like, what else can be used besides corn to make sure that we can meet these requirements without just relying on corn?
So did they have the parameters on the project like, hey, we want to know how avian species respond, we want to know how insects respond, or did you kind of get to set up your own research questions?
I think I didn't write it, but Andy and his team, I'm pretty sure, kind of wrote it and made sure that we looked at. But maybe you can speak more on to that.
So we got to kind of pitch together our proposal. So like for folks who are not familiar with like the federal process, and similar to state and NGOs, usually there's a call out there for funding for it, and it's usually under like a program area. And then you basically are developing proposals around that general theme. And then they have an evaluation process, which is very rigorous process. Other scientists and other reviewers are basically, reviewing those different, funding proposals, and then recommending, which ones, kind of weighed out a little higher than others. And then they have program managers in DC that actually make the executive decisions on which one should be funded. So ours just happened to be in that one that got funded. But we did have a very holistic, project collectively. And I think that's, I can speak to the value of it from a producer standpoint, is that, it had different aspects. And soil health was another piece of that. And there's still some ongoing work in that realm, and tying that into a little bit into the carbon realm as well, which is obviously another whole conversation. We have another whole episode on that with Audubon folks and TNC. So,
absolutely. So, obviously, you focused on the grassland bird component. What size of fields did you monitor? How did you monitor it? And kind of just dive into that a little bit for us, please.
Yeah. So we were located in Hays and Hitchcock County, Nebraska, which is in the southwestern corner, and it's right over the Ogallala Aquifer. Out there, most of the row crop are center irrigated. And basically, I actually worked with Pheasants Forever just to identify CRP sites, and then also CRP sites that were neighboring row crop sites. And then we tried to get landowners involved. We cold called them, and just asked if we could access their properties. And I think we ended with 20 CRP or perennial grassland fields and 6 row crop fields that were paired with CRP fields. And when I say paired, I mean directly adjacent. They were bordering each other. And then so we basically deployed all of our acoustic monitors, which I think we'll get into that later. And then we did point counts on them. They did a bunch of insect surveys on them. And then we compared the row crop and grassland sites to see kind of like how they would influence it. Obviously, we didn't have switchgrass fields to use just because switchgrass isn't readily grown here in this part of the United States. So we had to just kind of use low diversity grassland fields. And so, and then some of those additional grassland fields we just used to kind of incorporate different landscape aspects to kind of check if the placement of these grasslands was influencing what was in those fields.
And just to clarify, switchgrass does grow in Nebraska and in your area that you were operating, but people aren't growing it as monocultures, correct?
Yeah. So it's something that we found switchgrass in our grassland fields. That it's just not there's no monoculture switchgrass fields out there in Nebraska right now.
Were the landowners that you brought onto the project, were they open to working with you on the research project? Can you speak to that a little bit?
Oh, yes. They were very excited. I was very scared to make cold calls to farmers, but they were very receptive and interested. I think specifically all of them asked about pheasants. If I could, ask like if this is something that you'll find pheasants on and stuff. And I'm like, oh, yeah. But I think they were very interested in working with us. A lot of times when we first went out there and set up all of our equipment, they were right along with us. They drove us out there. They showed us places. They worked with us. The row crop farmers, we really had to work with them closely because we can't just put an acoustic monitor or some of that equipment just right in the middle of the rows of agriculture. We had to pick certain areas to put them in. And so working with them, they were very helpful.
Did that surprise you at how open they were to allowing you on your property to conduct research?
Yes and no. I'm from a farming community, and I think that they're very welcoming to some of those things. Mm-hmm. And I think it mostly depends on how you approach them. Just be polite and stuff. It's kind of like how you ask somebody to go hunting on their property. Oh, sure. You have to be very polite and stuff like that. But also I was worried. I don't know. I've never been out there. I'm not part of that community, that farming community. I'm part of Eastern Nebraska community. And so I didn't know if that was, going to be different, but yeah.
Sure. And I think I remember one of the analogies was like, if you get invited in for pie and coffee, like you definitely accept that opportunity. And I think that was one of the things that Grace quickly found, that a lot of folks were very welcoming to that. The other thing that I think really hit the nail on the head for a lot of folks is that we would end up sending out every year basically a newsletter to those landowners to update them on the research that both Dr. Peterson and on the pollinator side of things, and then our lab was doing. And I think that was really helpful, because I think sometimes, people end up having projects where maybe they don't really hear back. And so they're like, oh, you were out collecting data, but like, what happened? So we would actually send a update annually out. And then once the project's totally complete, we'll end up having basically a subsequent one that'll kind of wrap all of it up. And that'll get sent out to the landowners just to kind of show them all the different aspects and show them the value of doing this. Because I think that's, to me, we're in an era where we have to be able to co-produce science. I don't know all the stuff about like Grace's farm, for example, where she has that close connection, her and her family. And so using that as an analogy, they know things that are going to work more efficiently than I would. And so having that co-production is going to be critical moving forward, especially when we're trying to tackle these big, broad challenges in working lands with trying to put conservation practices strategically in that area. So
yeah, I think that is a good point, because I think they were just happy to be part of the conversation about what's going on. Because I don't think we had any farmers that I approached that said no. I think they all said yes, which is very cool.
Yeah,
that they want to be a part of that.
Yeah, and I think it goes to show exactly what you're saying. They want to be a part of it. We just need to meet them where they're at out in the field and say, hey, what can we do to help, and just be open to hearing them.
Yep.
So the overarching theme is that grassland birds are declining, correct?
Yes.
And that's kind of an important part of this research.
Yes, yeah. Grassland birds since pretty much the 1970s have showed a very steep decline, and that's mostly just due to widespread loss of grassland habitat across the Great Plains, following the, Euro-American people coming in here and, converting lands and homesteading and stuff like that. We just lost so much grasslands, and we continue to lose grasslands. But also the grasslands that are available are, sensitive to woody encroachment, invasive species, fragmentation, all that. And so, grassland birds are, we need to take initiatives to protect those grassland birds. Otherwise, they might not be here one day.
Sure. Yeah. I think that's a really good point, too. And thinking about, you mentioned earlier, like the landowners being excited about pheasants is maybe a connection point. You also can have birds that are obviously economically important as well for those landowners, and whether it be personal, just they love to hunt, or they have people that come hunt. And I think that's another perspective to also tie into that. And then you kind of think about managing for species like that, but then the spillover effects they have for non-game grassland birds that are out there on the landscape, and the power that you can have as you begin to manage those systems in that kind of basically creating those kind of functional complexes for various avian communities. So,
So what sort of monitoring techniques did you use on the perennials and the row crop acres?
Yeah, so we had So I called them our 12 paired sites just to make it easier. And those 12 paired sites were the 6 row crops that were paired with the 6 CRP fields or grassland fields. In each of those fields, we had acoustic monitoring units or acoustic recording units, ARUs, which are basically little recording devices that record during certain times of the day and record the sound in a certain landscape. We used those, and we installed them in the pivot centers in our row crop fields and then just randomly in our perennial grassland fields. And they recorded for 2 hours in the morning and 2 hours in the evening from March through September. And then we also used the traditional survey method, which is point count surveys. And that involved myself or my technicians going out usually between 6 a.m. and 10 a.m. on mornings with no wind, and basically standing out there for 15 minutes and counting all the birds that we heard or seen or saw. And so those are the two methods that we used to look at birds. But then we also did some vegetation surveys, and we tried to identify different vegetation species that were in both land uses, which was pretty easy in the row crop fields, just took, not too long. And then we also looked at, we did visual obstruction readings to estimate the density of vegetation in each And then we looked at the composition, so like how much of the grassland was grass, bare ground, forbs, things like that. So those are kind of all the methods we used.
Okay. And you may have said this and I may have missed it, were the row crops only corn and soybeans, or did you have some small grains in your study as well?
Just corn and soybeans.
Okay.
Yep.
Kind of going back to we're obviously focused on the grassland bird piece in this conversation today, but we have, as I noted, some of those other aspects from the pollinator side and from the soil health side. And a lot of this all ends up falling under this bigger challenge that we have in Nebraska and a lot of other Midwest states of not only are we losing habitat, but we also have the Ogallala Aquifer. And it's really critical that we conserve the water resources. And that's really what initially necessitated this project. And then we wanted to kind of branch out in these different arenas of the avian side and the grassland bird side, the soil health side, pollinator side, because ultimately all of this is coming back to address a larger problem. And that if we cannot continue to sustain that Ogallala Aquifer, then that's going to have dramatic impacts, negative impacts for our producers down the road. We got to ensure we're having recharge of that aquifer. And a lot of times we may kind of take it for granted. We get water out of the tap or whatever. And reality is that water has to come from somewhere. And so it's coming from underground. In a lot of cases, sometimes surface water, obviously. And out there, they're thinking about that underground reservoir of water. And if you're draining that down over time, and we think about a lot of areas are irrigated, especially out in her study area, that obviously can have an impact on that. And so we obviously think about how do we ensure that long-term sustainability with diverse cropping systems that may not need as much water. And that's where switchgrass came into play. And so just to kind of help frame that a little bit better around some of the larger challenges and then how this kind of led to some of these methods that we're going to talk about today. And I think it kind of ties right back to your ARU point of when we were putting an ARU out in an ag field, we were putting it usually by that pivot center because that was the easiest place to put that was not going to get impacted by equipment, the pivot moving through the field, et cetera, is where we would actually base those monitors at. So,
well, and that brings up a good point. When you were placing these ARUs out on the landscape, is there anything that popped up that you were kind of surprised? Like, was it a pivot motor running when you wish it would have been capturing birds? Like, what were the points in your research that you had to kind of figure out what you had to overcome?
Yeah, that's a good question. We had, so with those ARUs being right underneath those pivots, we heard the pivot motor, we heard the water, the irrigation hitting it, which kind of caused a lot of the sound to be, not really useful as far as birds. And then we use this automatic classifying system called BirdNet, which I'm sure many people are familiar with. But it basically goes through and listens to this audio and identifies which birds are vocalizing. And it actually thought that a pivot clicking and turning was a pheasant. So we had all of these wrong detections, and that was something I had to pull apart and find those wrong detections. We also, in the perennial grassland or in the grasslands and just kind of across the board, we also had issues with machinery driving down the roads and hitting those, what do you call those bumps in the road?
The washboards?
Yeah, washboards. And then thinking it was like a prairie chicken or something, just like a bunch of misidentifications because that ARU is recording all sounds, not just birds, all sounds. And so, yeah, we caught some farmers talking randomly in their fields. I couldn't tell you what they said, but it was just interesting things like that. But yeah.
Yeah. And I imagine from being out there until I think you said March through September, I mean, that's probably thousands of hours of audio.
Oh, yeah. I mean, let's see. In 1 year, I think we had 6,000 hours of audio recording. And then by the end of it, I think we were in the terabytes of audio recordings. And that all has to be analyzed. And
imagine sitting there if you had to listen to all that.
You'd probably go crazy.
I know. I wouldn't be done. I'd have to.
Yeah, you wouldn't be done. Grace would be here for another 10 years.
Yeah.
So then that, like you were saying, you put that data into BirdNet, right? And then it just kind of gives you a little bit less to look at, because I'm assuming at some point you have to go through it, right? And check, yes, this is a bird. No, this isn't.
Yeah. So we have, we're pretty used to using BirdNet, and BirdNet goes through and listens and then provides basically identifications of what it thinks the vocalization is. And then it provides a confidence score of how confident it is in that identification. And we have developed protocols to basically confirm by listening to smaller subsets of clips throughout the recordings, and to confirm whether how well BirdNet is performing by identifying certain bird species.
Yeah, and I think if you didn't, in the absence of that, then you would go crazy having to listen to all that audio.
Yeah, you
never get. I do remember actually when I was doing my PhD at the University of Georgia. That was back in the early days. Some of the technology out there, even probably before BirdNet, and you did have to listen to a lot more of that. Now it wasn't all of it, but you definitely had to listen when you get a lot of false positives or false negatives in the classification, and it just took a lot of work to be able to analyze all that data, because you can imagine just how many hours of audio that is, quantified across not just one day, but and multiple monitors, but months of the year. So
yeah, without a doubt. So you had. How many ARUs did you have out?
12.
12. Okay. One per site. Gotcha.
Yes.
And then obviously, what are some of the results from this? I guess the most simple one would be, did grasslands have more songbirds or was it row crops?
So interestingly, it depends on what type of birds we're talking about. So grasslands, not surprisingly, had higher species richness of grassland obligates, or species that rely and breed in grasslands. And then the row crops had more habitat generalists, so like common grackle, your red-winged blackbirds, species that can utilize pretty much all different kinds of habitats. And throughout most of the year, those species used those. They kind of stayed, in their certain realms. But overall, we also found that species of conservation concern in Nebraska, they were more in the grassland fields as well. Well, most of them are grassland specialist species, so that kind of makes sense as well. But I think it's interesting because when I was out there working with some of these farmers setting these ARUs up, and I was kind of explaining the research, they made the comment, well, there's, birds in the row crops, they are out there. And so I think it's an important distinction that those birds are not the grassland species that we're talking about. They're more the habitat generalists, your robins and stuff. I found out that American robins love the irrigation that happens in the middle of those row crop fields, so they're everywhere.
Very interesting.
So can you explain to folks like grassland obligate species, like if you have some examples of what that might be?
Yeah, good. Yeah. So like dick thistles, grasshopper sparrows, western meadowlark, our state bird, is a grassland obligate or grassland specialist. And they basically breed in grassland habitat. They nest in grassland habitat. And their resources are mainly here or in the grassland habitat. And then habitat generalists, they can use row crops, forests, yards, random areas. Everywhere. Yeah. So, yeah.
That's cool.
Was there any difference in patch size of your perennial habitat pieces?
Yes. So, unfortunately, we really couldn't be too picky about our grassland areas and trying to make them uniform. So we had grasslands that ranged from like 40 hectares to 120 hectares or something. Yeah, I think that was our range.
Off the top of your head, do you know what those are in acres? For folks who may not be familiar with hectares.
No, I don't. I'm sorry.
I always have to do the conversion every time, but I think it's like a little over 2, isn't it? I could be wrong.
Yeah. And when we picked out sites, one of the things, this was kind of going back to some earlier discussions on this, we basically said they had to be a minimum of 10 acres, fields. So we were those grassland fields as kind of a minimum size. And that was one of the challenges when we first started the project, because obviously a lot of the work, especially in the agronomy realm, they tend to do a lot of small plot research. And so that was a little bit of a challenge that we, the research team, had to discuss, like, how do we do this? And so there are, as a collective part of this project, other sites that some of the USDA folks and agronomy folks that are working on that they're not sampling at the same sites we are. They have some of those sites that are, but then they have other small plot research sites as well, because they don't necessarily need the scale that we have. And the reason being is, we're dealing with birds. And so birds are, if you have a little small, like 1/4 acre plot, that's probably not going to be very beneficial to a lot of birds. They need something a little bit larger than that. And so that's why we kind of put a threshold of about 10 acres the minimum, and then anything up beyond that, and kind of that selection process.
So as you went up in size then, did you see greater species richness, greater species diversity, or was that not necessarily true?
I would say it's true. We saw more game birds, I think, in those greater tracts. Greater prairie chicken, those really big tracts had a lot more of those. And yeah, I was very impressed, honestly, with the size of their grasslands out there that are in conservation programs, especially compared to over here in the eastern side. They're just, not as big as I feel like the ones over in that side of the state. But yeah, it wasn't too different. We really didn't see a big difference of species richness across sites. And I think that might have been just due to a lot of the bird species that we saw over every site. It wasn't just that this grassland over here had a bunch of dick thistles or this one had a bunch of western meadowlarks. They were kind of uniform across. And I think that's just due to there was more grassland out there than over here. I think if you conducted this exact same study here on the eastern side, I think you would have very different results, which I think is kind of interesting.
Oh, yeah.
Just because if you were to grow switchgrass, you would probably want to do it on the eastern side of the state because it's more rain-fed. Yep. Now we want to protect the Okalala Aquifer. That's why we did it over there. Yep. But really, I think it'd be easier to cultivate it over on the eastern side, which I think it would have more benefits for grassland birds over here almost.
Well, and the other thing that would be interesting to think about is you were in diverse grasslands, right?
Yes.
So it would be interesting to see, because that would be a whole nother research question, would be monoculture switchgrass compared to a diverse pasture CRP planting.
Oh, yeah.
Because I bet they're not going to weigh out the same. I bet you would get different results as well.
Definitely. And switchgrass, you want to they want to manage it for bioenergy potential. Sure. So they're going to limit the amount of diversity or the amount of plant species besides switchgrass that are in there. Now, there is some, forbs in there that when you spray, you miss or something. But it is pretty monoculture. So again, that might influence. There might be more habitat generalists in the switchgrass fields compared to grassland obligants because it's missing that diversity.
Yeah. And I think inherently that was one of the challenges when we started the project, back to what you mentioned earlier, like having sites like at Mead. Like there's just not a lot of sites that have switchgrass at scale. And so that basically was like, okay, well, if we want to do the project and we want to look at avian communities, we're going to have to find a surrogate for that. And some folks, I think it was over in, was it Wisconsin? There was maybe another comparative study where they did something similar in the past. And basically what they did was essentially the model we did was that basically you had to find other sites, CRP sites that had switchgrass within them and find those kind of mixtures that would allow us to best get a comparison, knowing that we're not going to have this perfect one-to-one relationship until it's actually adopted at a larger scale. Then you can start exploring those kind of monocultural versus diverse CRP enrollment. And I guess the other thing to clarify too, that was also part of the conversation when we first started this, even with the conservation groups is, hey, if we have a very monocultural based crop, what is that going to do for, habitat long term? And that's just the reality of it. And basically our point was, well, we don't really have it at that scale yet. So let's do work now as kind of a baseline. And then if down the road there's an opportunity to do exactly what you're saying, Nate, as you had kind of comparisons, that would be the really cool study. Then you could start looking at diverse mixtures versus that monoculture, and we would expect to have more species, grassland birds in the diverse species mixture.
Was there anything that surprised you on the acoustic recording units, either from the row crop or the perennial habitat, as far as like species you detected?
Not really on the acoustic monitors, but I do have one with the point counts. That's kind of interesting. There was a study site that we actually didn't include because of something that happened. But when I first started in 2021, it was a grassland that had burrowing owls on it. And so we continuously collected them with our point count surveys. And then during my end of my second year, they plowed it up and they put wheat in, and then they killed off the wheat and then put corn in. So they changed it. They converted it during my study. And the burrowing owls were there up until the last year when it went to corn. So they were in the grassland, then they were in the wheat, and then they left during the corn. And I never heard them again. So that was kind of like surprising to see that transition of just loss, I guess, of that
Sure.
species out there. That's a very cool species, and I think a species of conservation concern here in Nebraska.
Sure.
So that was kind of hard to see, but you have to understand, but that was...
And so you mentioned you didn't use that set of data in your analysis. Is that because it got transitioned out of perennial habitat?
Yep. So since it was, 1 year CRP, 1 year CRP, then wheat, and then 1 year row crop, it was just too much. It wasn't, it was too lack of control, I guess, over what it was. So, yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, by itself, that's a pretty unique data set anyways, because I'm sure there's a lot of stuff or a lot of little tidbits information you could pull out of it.
But I guess I wish we had an acoustic monitor out there instead of point counts, because you would have been able to just see that decline of burrowing owls throughout those 3 years because of that transition, I'm sure.
And we can talk more about this later, but that actually is a part of one of the ideas that we've talked about, Grace and I, at length, of monitoring change in the landscape. And so as you convert some of these fields, we don't usually have a lot of that data long term. And ARUs are just an example of a tool you can put out there, collect a mass amount of data, and we can analyze that, and you can look at those changes through time. And that, I guess, was kind of leading one of the things I was going to ask you about. So you just mentioned point counts. So, and you had ARUs. So can you kind of explain to people what a point count is, like what you actually did out of those sites? So you got the monitors out there. They're collecting that data. You said 2 hours before, basically before sunrise, around sunrise, 2 hours later in the day. And then you're also doing point counts on top of that. Like, why were you doing that? Like, what does that look like?
So the point counts were important because it's basically like in-person manual confirmation of those bird species. So we're not just relying on AI or recording. We're going out there and we can actually take counts. So you go out there and basically you walk out to a certain predetermined point. For 5 minutes, you sit there and you kind of let, if you ever done a point count or just gone out, you'll scare a bunch of birds away. As you walk in, you're flushing things out. And so 5 minutes, you just stand there and you kind of let them all calm down and get used to you out there. You take a bunch of weather and time and different you write down a bunch of notes and stuff like that. And then for 10 minutes, you are basically listening to all the birds you can and counting them and stuff like that. And then you leave, and then you kind of keep repeating that. Well, the benefit of having an acoustic monitor out there is, again, when you do a point count, you're flushing things away. Rare cryptic species are going to take off. You're not going to be able to get them an account because they don't want to see you or be around you. And then also with those acoustic monitors, you're able to detect species that may be there for only a few days and you might be missing for a point count, because we can't just stand out there for hours on end and do a point count. That's not going to work. So I really like acoustic monitors, if you couldn't be able to tell. But you have to do point counts with them as well, just to get that confirmation and to kind of get like boots on the ground estimates.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, I think, is to your point, I mean, I think the ARUs and just having them open up a huge door, just a huge opening for citizen scientists, right?
Yeah.
Just to be able to figure out what's in their backyard, right? For somebody who can't be out there in the mornings or can't be out there for 6,000 hours, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, I'm really excited to see just where the ARUs go in general.
Or even farmers, if they want to know what's on their properties, that's very important. I think that a lot of our landowners were very interested to understand or to see what they have on their properties, and that they have a burrowing owl or prairie chickens or pheasants or western meadowlarks, stick thistles. They like to know that stuff too. Sure. And then how maybe their management choices might affect that as well. Yep. I think that would, give them an idea of the effect that they're having on their environment beyond just soil and water.
And that's a really good point, because that goes back to this co-production of science and thinking about what changes am I doing and what is that impact? So for example, we use, precision ag data. So I can take and use my yield monitor data to make determinations of how well things are doing, my nitrogen application, how well that performed relative to crop production. I can use that kind of almost near real-time data that you're collecting throughout the season to make more informed decisions. And that's where I think ARUs have the ability to do very much the same thing, as being able to make informed decisions on what practices am I implementing and what are the potential positive and negative impacts of that. And if I want, to your point, if you want more meadowlarks or you want more pheasants or quail or whatever, what can I do to actually get more of them? Okay, well, now I've done this practice. That say they reach out to Nate and enroll in some like full season cover crops or whatever practice. What now that I've implemented that, what is that return on investment? Not just from an economic standpoint, that's usually what we kind of go to, but just that overall land stewardship perspective of, okay, hey, I'm now hearing more pheasants or more quail or more whatever you plug it in because of what I'm doing. And I think that constant like learning or unfolding of that relationship with the land, like Aldo Leopold talks about this in his books, and he's the father of wildlife management. He like it really, to me, it's like you're really building that connection to the land and what you're doing in that operational piece, as opposed to, hey, I'm just farming it and I'm not really learning a lot. Most farmers obviously want to learn from what they're doing to continue to improve their operation. And so I think it's just another tool in their proverbial toolbox as a farmer to be able to help them. And then we have resources, and we're going to be building more of those out in the coming years here at the university to be able to have and make those things available so people could do exactly just what we're describing.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, especially for folks who maybe don't know farmers and ranchers.
Sure.
Right? Farmers and ranchers, they always want to know if they're making their land better or for wildlife.
Stewards, yeah.
Exactly.
Yep.
They're stewards of the land. And I think a lot of times that's kind of lost when you get into larger cities where you don't have that connection to the land.
Yep, absolutely.
And kind of digging into that a little more, I want to unpack for those who may not be familiar with row crop systems and perennial systems. I want to unpack the difference between the two. Obviously, row crops, they're going to be annual crops, right? So you plant something in the spring more often than not, and then it's harvested in the fall. There's some other crops, but you just mentioned corn and soybeans were in this practice. Mm-hmm. In your data, when did you see the most grassland birds coming through? And I think this will dig into just the different management at the different land types.
It's a really good question. But I want to say that when we looked at the temporal trends between the two, and to see those jumps, we were just looking at vocalizations, so not actual numbers. Where we had the most vocalizations, which we can say they're being the most active, or perhaps maybe there's more of them, that was during like May, when they were readily breeding and trying to find nesting habitat. So we can't say that there's more of them. We can just say they were talking a lot during that time. And so that's probably because they were looking for, nesting cover. They had, babies out there. They had nests they were protecting. But yeah, really that it kind of just slowly goes down, the activity, as like farther you get to September or like throughout the season. So
well, and I think that's important to note, and I appreciate you kind of unpacking that a little more, because in April and May, right, that's when planting season's starting to kick off. So there's not usable structure for the most part within our row crop acres. So that's why these perennial acres are ever more important, right?
Mm-hmm. Yep. And I mean, that's why you have specific guidelines of when you should hay in those perennial grasslands, because there have nests out there during that time and throughout that breeding season. But yeah, there's no cover out there during, May or April. You might have your little tiny corn pops out, but that's about it. A lot of just bare ground, which for some species like killdeer, they love that. That's awesome for them. But for the majority of your grassland specialists who, again, nest in thick, dense grasses, that's just not going to work for them. And so, yeah, I'm glad you also talked about that perennial annual kind of contrast, because for switchgrass and those perennial species, it's also the main difference is, in my opinion, is their ability to stabilize soil. That's a big, you're not, with annuals, you're not annually disturbing the soil. Yep. Perennials, you have like a lot of those root systems and that carbon sequestration, and just a lot more ecological benefits on that side, including nesting for grassland birds during those crucial times.
Yep.
When did you see the most activity on the row crop acres as opposed to the grassland acres? Or was there a noticeable difference?
There wasn't really a peak. It was there wasn't really a peak. It was just kind of the same. You had some species that I think we heard, like grassland obligate species, that we would hear in the row crops. And that seemed to be when later in the season when I think the irrigation was running. And they were using the irrigation and those center pivots as almost like a unique water source in that
Sure.
kind of arid land, especially when it got hotter.
Oh, wow.
And I'm guessing that there was also some insect activity, in those water areas too that affected them. But that's really the only peak we saw. There wasn't ever a distinguishable, oh yeah, wow, they're really busy out there right now.
Yeah, that's really interesting because, correct me if I'm wrong, but your research took course over the course of years that had droughts, right? Over drought years. So yeah, I mean, it's probably not a surprise that our grassland birds were being pulled to those areas. Yeah, that's an interesting point.
I think it's actually a really cool study idea is to figure out how center pivots in really arid environments might be influencing all types of wildlife.
Yeah.
I mean, we didn't have that, 50 years ago, we didn't have those center pivot irrigation systems, so that's kind of interesting.
Yeah, they might have, thinking about back to another episode on butterflies, monarchs, thinking about, how they kind of shift their behaviors and kind of their travel patterns because of environmental factors. Maybe that, historically, maybe they did have to shift because you had drought conditions, but maybe now with irrigation, they don't have to shift as much because they have more reliable resources. At least to a point, and that's part of the necessity of the project. Yeah, that's a really good question.
Looking at your row crop system specifically, was there any use of cover crops within any of that cropping rotation, or was it just strictly corn and soybeans?
No cover crops, just strictly soybeans and corn. There was an individual who would graze his corn stalks, but that was about it, which... interesting enough, he put them on and then he texted me. I put cattle on and our ARUs were still out. And I was like, oh my gosh. And so they did kind of knock it over, but not too bad. But that just shows the relationships I guess we had with them. By the way.
Yeah,
but
exactly.
yeah, no cover crops, unfortunately.
And so while those cattle were out there, were you able to notice any sort of a difference in avian communities?
Not really, because I think it was so late in the season. They were either they migrated away or they were onto other different land uses. And we didn't really, specify. I would assume that there was probably more cowbirds out there, but we didn't really hone in on that species, specifically during that time.
So what other findings from your research were you kind of surprised about or that you want to touch on that maybe we don't know since I'm not well-versed in your research?
Yeah. Part of my dissertation was actually interviewing landowners that were a part of this project. And we just kind of interviewed them on diversity of landscapes, kind of the changes that they saw, the benefits of non-crop habitat like perennial grasslands or hay pastures or pretty much any non-row crop land uses. And we kind of asked them also the benefits to wildlife, bird species, and arthropods with those two land uses. And kind of our main finding was that farmers have a very, very good understanding of the ecological system and the impacts that they have on nature and ecosystems as a whole. And I think that a lot of times when they make those decisions, it's not like they dislike the environment and they want to see it. They're purely making those decisions based on economic incentives and the fact that they need to feed their family and support their community. And so that was something that we really want to get published because sometimes I feel like they get the, low end of the stick and they just get the, they're not doing everything right. But I think, when it's a business, you have a business and they do really like to see all of those wildlife species and they don't like to see them not be there. But that's just kind of like the issue. And I think if we could show them more support, I think that would be beneficial. But
yeah, and that brings up a farmer I had. This was a few years back at Pheasants Forever State Habitat meeting. He came up and he was pretty stoic at the back of the room, kind of as I was presenting on precision conservation and opportunities for putting in things like prairie strips and things like that in your land. And he, as I walked out, he had a conversation with me. He said, I have some land. I think it was up in northeast Nebraska. He's like, we've been obviously dealing with erosion issues and other things going on, and we don't see pheasants up there anymore. And he was like, if all I have to do is put in like 10% of my fields into perennial plants, that's all I'd have to do, and I could see some of these big impacts. Like he's like, I'm thinking about down the road, my kids, my grandkids, and long-term sustainability of our operation. And that goes back to what you were just saying. I think they're very in tune with the system. Mm-hmm. I think the challenge is that, there's economic pressures against them. And I say this all the time. Producers, they're like anybody else. They, obviously you have to feed your family at the end of the day. You got to pay off bills. I don't also think a lot of people probably really get the, how much goes into an operation. They're not getting a paycheck every couple weeks. And so that there's a lot of calculation, a lot of things that they have to kind of weigh in that decision-making process. And it's not that there's not a care there. It's, hey, I have to be able to pay the bills. And if there's pressures from basically the market kind of pushing me towards doing that, I'm just going to do that because I got to be able to pay the bills. And that's the reality of it. And ultimately, it goes back to they truly do care about that operation. And use your family as a good example, kind of passing down your guys' farm from generation to generation. You guys want to ensure that long-term sustainability. And so how do we do that? And that's where I think, working with folks like Pheasants Forever, or working with Game and Parks, other agencies like that, finding, even if it's just 5% or 10% of your operation, you can just do small things. It doesn't have to be massive conversion of all of your operation, but then it also opens a door for you to have a diversified set of funding opportunities. So if corn or soybean prices are down, oh, hey, I have something else that may help offset that in those down times. And so again, thinking about it from that kind of perspective, I actually have a slide in some of my presentations. I have a farmer kind of looking off into the sunset, and I always say, you got to put yourself in the shoes of the producer. That farmer there, what are they experiencing, the challenges, and why do they make those decisions? And I think that's so important. And if you don't come from that perspective, you're not really going to be able to understand why they're doing that, and therefore you're not going to be able to develop programs or other opportunities to help them. And again, that really goes back to the co-production of science. Meeting with them, walking alongside them. I know, Nate, you do a really good job with that full season cover crop stuff, walking with those producers and what the challenges they're facing. And then we have to customize. Our programs have to be flexible to be able to meet some of these needs that farmers are facing across the state and beyond.
I think it was really interesting. They were able to talk so much about the changes that they saw throughout their farming careers. I mean, most of these guys had been farming for multiple generations since they were young. And so they saw one farmer mentioned the lack of wheat stubble left in the fields, lack of pheasants. They noticed the, loss of honeybees. They noticed the change in the landscape. It's not smaller fields, these giant fields. And they realize kind of what's going on. And so I think kind of paying attention to those firsthand accounts of what's happening is just really crucial and giving them kind of a voice in this research. Again, how we've been talking about. Yeah.
Sure.
On the perennial acres that you were researching, were those all in CRP? Were they pastured? What were landowners using those perennial acres for?
More than half were in CRP. Some of them were in different programs. Others were grazed lands that somebody has for their cattle. And the cattle were kept off during our study just because we were needed to access them. So kind of a mix. But I would say the majority of those paired 12 that we had acoustic monitors on, I think 5 out of 6 were CRP.
Okay.
So most of them were CRP.
Yeah, and I think there's, again, and that's like going back to that study design, that was pretty important. We had to get more grassland dominated. So that was really the best way to get that was through the CRP program. And so I always enjoyed, hearing from Grace when she was out in the field and just interactions she had, because back to the farmers, again, I think this was one of the first big projects I took on as a new faculty member at the time. And then hearing a lot of that co-production perspective really kind of shaped me over the past several years of it makes sense. We have to walk alongside people, and we have to be able to take and figure out innovative solutions that may not have, there is no cookie cutter approach to every land. And like you said, taking this project, it was in western Nebraska, southwest Nebraska, move that over here to southeast Nebraska. Likely very different results. And I think that's the importance of the science. But two, you're able to meet a different need in a different portion of the state, and thinking about how do we, especially in this portion of the state of Nebraska, soil rental rates are a lot higher. And that may also be why you saw some of those larger fields.
Yeah.
Soil rental rates are a lot lower over in that part of the state. So, there's a lot of area that's just not as productive. And so we can take and put that into larger contracts versus over here, soil rental rates, for comparison could be $350, $400 an acre versus over there. It's like could be $50 to $75 an acre, dramatically different rates. So it's harder in this part of the state to keep those longer term programs in place because it's just easier to obviously continue to get a larger payment from, the current monocultures are out there. So that's where I think, especially as we continue into the future, where we need to do more work in areas like this where you have high soil rental rates to figure out those innovative solutions for farmers.
Yeah.
To say, hey, we have some big challenges here. How do we work alongside you to figure out how to make this actually operational? Because I think there's a very significant difference between coming up with a really cool research project and design and saying this is how we want to, we think this is a good product. And if you don't involve the producer from the beginning, that can basically set it up to be a project where it's not going to be very applicable at the end of the day. I want application. So that's where that co-production I continue to harp on is going back to that because I think it's so critical in the next 5, 10, 15 years of research we do in our systems. So,
do you know, based off the results that you shared with your growers, did any of them change any sort of management techniques, or did they consider putting anything else into perennial habitat, or what was that conversation like with growers?
I don't think so. We did not have a lot of follow-up. So maybe that's something that we should have done is kind of followed up with them from a year and say, how did that affect you? Was that study important to you? Which is actually, that's a very good idea. But I also think since they were in the western part of the state in that agriculture region, which does face more challenges than the eastern part of the state with erosion and, water conditions and stuff, I think that every acre that they had that could be put into, some type of perennial grassland was probably put into perennial grassland. I think they have to be a lot more picky on what they farm just because they have a lot more challenges than over here in eastern Nebraska.
So there's a cultural component there that they want to have grass on the landscape then?
I can't say I would hope that they want, but I also think they just that's how they control their erosion. That's how they make money on some of those lands. Over here, if you put enough chemical and you plant a certain acre that is probably not going to be very productive, you're probably going to get enough rain and have the capabilities to get a pretty good crop off of it. Over there, you really have to be picky of what you use and how you use your water. And so I think the challenges have forced them to strategically choose acre by acre what they're going to farm. Yep. And so that's something that honestly I'd like to see happen over here too, is kind of strategically looking acre on acre. So we can learn something from them in that way, I think.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I think it'd be fun just to be able to replicate that over here because I think you would see dramatically different results. And I would love to hear different farmer perspectives, as you're alluding to, in this part of the country versus out west, and kind of seeing how they may differ based on those needs that they have and the experiences that they have on the landscape.
So what do you think, how can your research be used by conservationists, biologists who are out there working with landowners out on the landscape? What would you tell them is the main point of your research? What can they use to kind of dictate how they're working with landowners?
I would say grassland birds and bird species that are in very much decline are in grasslands, not row crops. And by including perennial grasslands even near your row crops, you're going to see more grassland birds in the landscape as a whole. What I mean by that is to kind of look at it at the landscape level and just taking, like Andy said, 10% of your cropland out. And if each farmer does that, and if each section does that, you could have a pretty, a good area of grassland. And so I just think, again, targeting acre by acre and trying to just put grassland where you can and put perennials where you can. I think that's really important. I also think from this research, which, again, unfortunately, we didn't have switchgrass, pure switchgrass monoculture fields. Unfortunately, we just had CRP. But switchgrass is a very viable option for another crop that could just be introduced into the agricultural landscape of Nebraska. And I think that would add more resilience to the landscape. So we're not just focusing on corn and soybeans. And hopefully that would also add to the grasslands on the landscape. It's just kind of like another option. So yeah, grasslands help grassland birds. And switchgrass is a really good future option that I think if we can change some policies and keep pushing towards having switchgrass as a commodity, I think that would be very beneficial to the ag landscape.
Yeah.
So does it seem, and obviously I'm not asking you to be an expert on it, but does it seem like it's more at the political level that why we don't have switchgrass used in biofuel production? Or
yeah, this is, I would have to just do my opinion and based on my research. I think it's more, what comes first, the switchgrass or the technology to convert the switchgrass. So you almost have to have like a group of farmers come together and say, we're all going to grow switchgrass, and then have a bioethanol plant say, okay, I'll put in the technology because I know I have this feedstock coming in by this time. And again, with that switchgrass, the whole entire first year that you plant that switchgrass, you can't harvest it. It's growing up. So it's like a 2-year endeavor until you're actually going to see a payout, which is really hard for people. I mean, that's not easy. So yeah, it's kind of like what came first, the chicken or the egg? What comes first, the switchgrass or the technology?
And right, that's a conversation about just diversifying crop systems in general. Just is a huge struggle for growers out there because you can't just plant a crop that you don't have a market for. So it's extremely difficult and something that I don't know who has the answer to it, but somebody needs to help growers. I mean, get those markets going.
Yeah, and that's something I don't have the expertise on where that needs to come from, but that is definitely something, that's important.
Well, and I think that actually speaks to a larger challenge that I think we do need to have a conversation with is we need to have from the kind of the corporations to the federal government, to state government, NGO, different partners collectively working together. And I know there's some initiatives already on this. I think about some things with Kellogg and General Mills and other things out there. But the point is we have to have these kind of collective discussions about where do we go in the next 30 to 50 years. And I use that as just to kind of help frame this bigger picture that it's not just going to be one person or one organization. It's going to be a collective change in the system to be able to take and see, adoption of, things like switchgrass. Because if there's no incentive for people to do it, they're just not going to do it. Or another conundrum will be is if I got to take and truck this stuff 4 hours away, am I going to do that or not? Like, is it going to pay out for me? If it's not, then I'm not going to do it. And I think it goes back to your point. Like if you have a market, you got a few producers working together, several producers, and you got one of those bioethanol facilities that can be altered and they can put into the equipment to do it, it totally can work. It's just a function of we got to get the piece of the puzzle at multiple levels to be able to actually drive that. And so I don't know who the right people are in a sense to be able to do all that. But I kind of use like corn and soybeans as an example. Like obviously there was a conversion over time with that. We've always grown corn for decades, but the expansion of that really took off back in the 60s, early 70s. And so like the model that, maybe help facilitate some of that, maybe some of the things we kind of learn from and say, how do we kind of take and make this into an alternative? And I think like with corn is a good illustration because I think, there's constantly innovation around like what other products could we get out of corn? So similarly, what other products could we get out of small grains? Could we get out of, other diverse crops that we could grow in the landscape? So that we, again, are helping producers to find those ways to diversify. And then they say, hey, there's a market there. I can immediately plug right into that. So, yeah, I think there's a huge opportunity. I think this research is a great illustration to me that you can get there. It's just a function of getting the right people and organizations in place to actually make that happen.
Without a doubt. So as with any good research project, what are some questions that popped up at the end or throughout the project that you think require more research or warrant another full-scale research project?
I mean, I think the obvious one is actually looking at switchgrass and its effects on insects and pollinators and birds and wildlife in general. I think that's very, important. our research, I think, opened the door, but I think there's a lot more behind that we didn't look at or weren't able to look at. The social science side behind it all, I think we only touched on. Doing those interviews was just like a small add-on to my dissertation. It wasn't actually in the grant. And so I think more social science research on farmers and, farmers' ability to diversify and just basically what we've been talking about of like policy changing. And, I don't think they just want to, I think they are very interested in growing crops other than just corn and soybeans and diversifying their systems. So that kind of social science research definitely. And then there was economics on it, but I think the economics could go so much deeper. Oh, yeah. But that's with anything. I think we could always go deeper with the economics, but yeah.
Did you find anything worth sharing on the economics in your particular research project?
I didn't do anything with the economics, really. The agronomist on our Jay Parsons, I think he was Dr. Jay Parsons. He was the leader on that. I don't know if he found anything noteworthy.
I don't know details. That'd actually be a good person to bring on and maybe have him talk about some of that research and their findings with his postdoc on the economic side. A separate conversation.
Yeah, I think it's breaking down. Switchgrass would require a lot less inputs compared to corn and soybeans. However, it's a long process of, like I said, preparing the switchgrass till you're actually going to get a payout. And you almost need kind of like a payment to get through those couple of years while your switchgrass is growing. So I think that's kind of what it comes down to, in my opinion.
Which could be an innovation.
Yeah.
This is a quick aside. That could be one of your innovations. That could be an opportunity to diversify. Because you think about, you're hearing all the discussion right now with overseas wars going on and concerns about fertilizer and and the prices spiking and saying, hey, maybe there's a way we can put less fertilizer on but also have some entry payments. So I think that's a cool opportunity to that's where I'm hopeful a lot of these conversations continue from this research and other research projects we're involved in, is driving that innovation with our producers. What would help them actually make this reasonable? So that we're not really wasting time doing stuff that's not, it might be like it's neat to know, but it's not really a need to know type of thing, as Annie Bishop likes to say. So.
Yeah, absolutely. So as we look to wrap this episode up, is there anything else you'd like to share about your research or the partners or anything else?
I guess just overall, I was really grateful to be a part of that project. It was, such a collaborative opportunity. I met so many people. I had the capability to learn so much. Dr. Rob Mitchell, he was on my committee. He taught me everything about switchgrass. I got a very in-depth, very in-depth opportunity to learn about the switchgrass, and I was very appreciative on that. But yeah, I'm just happy to be a part of it.
Absolutely. And now that you wrapped your PhD up, now where are you taking your talents now?
I am going to continue at UNL. I'm going to be working with Dr. Dirac Twidwell in the agronomy and horticulture department here on campus. And I'm just going to be looking at woody encroachment in Great Plains grasslands and how we can hopefully mitigate that working with farmers. So
you could probably deploy some ARUs for that research, I imagine.
Hope so, yeah.
We hope we can do that. Yeah, I'm bummed that I'm going to end up losing Grace here another day, but at the end of the day, it's going to be an opportunity for her to continue on, and maybe we'll end up hiring her back at some point. But hopefully continue to build on some of these collaborative efforts. ODROC and many other faculty members here at the university have a lot of interest in the conservation of working lands and thinking about how do we tackle some of these broader problems, broader challenges are facing farmers across the state and beyond. So.
Definitely.
Well, thank you, Grace. We greatly appreciate you taking the time out of your busy schedule to sit down with us for this episode. So thank you.
Yeah, of course. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks for listening, everybody.
Are you enjoying the Wild Ag Podcast? You or your organization can sponsor upcoming episodes that bring important information to listeners just like you. To learn more, visit our website, go.unl.edu/wildag.
Wild Ag is part of the Natural Resources University Podcast Network. If you enjoy this podcast, please leave us a review so others can find us and tune in.
And we want to hear from you. You can submit questions or topic suggestions to us at wildagpodcast@gmail.com. That's WILDAG podcast@gmail.com. Thanks for listening.